Well, enough of your promises, inaction and double standards. Those are some of the sentiments shared by young African climate activists at the COP27 currently underway in Egypt. Now, the African Child Policy Forum, or the ACPF, warns that the social and economic burden of climate change could mean a future of poor or no education, ill health, lack of employment, low productivity and negligible growth for many Africans. And Dr. Joan Nyanyuki is the Executive Director of ACPF, and she joins us now for more on these conversations. Dr. Nyanyuki, thanks for your time. Welcome to Morning Live.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
So, of course, great anticipation, but also great interest in the many discussions taking place in Egypt regarding Africa's current climate standing and future prospects. But what is your view on the discussions that have been had so far?
It's been just, 2-3 days of discussions, and I'm just following them, of course, based on what's being reported in the media. I feel quite optimistic. The tone has been set very well. We can see heads of multilaterals, whether it's the EU, whether it's Western nations, academics, researchers, the chair of COP27, really putting in strong messages about implementing together. So I think the tone has started very well. But I think it's not just the tone now that's important. What's important now is how much we're going to see in terms of real action. It's a positive side that you're seeing, again, the commitments in terms of financing are going up. Now we're talking trillions, in 2020, we're talking about, from 2009, we're talking about 100 billion, but now we are going into the trillions. So it's starting on a high note. But I think the important thing is to make sure that the conversations that are happening do not end up simply as rhetoric and words without actions. So this is really a time when we are saying it's about putting actions and putting money behind all these commitments and the rhetoric that's been going on for far too long.
Dr. Nyanyuki, when you talk about these trillions, and of course, your focus is very much about, the children and that perspective as well when it comes to the climate crisis that threatens the whole world, but, specifically looking at our continent. When we talk about those trillions, should we not be concerned about the terms and conditions attached to that, especially as it stands to affect our children and future generations in terms of the repayments, if these are in fact loans?
Yes, we should be. We should be concerned first because even the billions were not delivered. And the little of the billions that actually got to the African continent came with so much conditions, so much interest, so many, shall I say, shackles, that it's not really been beneficial to Africa adapting and putting in the necessary systems it needs to safeguard its children. And we're talking about now half a billion children. Africa has currently 500 million children. We're saying in the next 30 years, we're going to have 1 billion children. And so as we're having the conversations on, is the money going to come to Africa in the right form? And then is it going to be used in the right way, in a way that ensures that children have access to sufficient food? Children are not going hungry. Children can continue to go to school. Children are not being forced into displacement. Communities are not having to shift because of drought. And so then it brings us back, and all these things we're talking about children and food access and drought, it brings us to what does this financing look like? We already know that 75% of the financing that so far come to African continent is on mitigation. And African governments have not been able to shift this because the funding has so many conditions. There are no concessions. And so the funding needs to be responsive to what Africa needs. And what Africa needs is adaptation. Adaptation that helps the continent to become more resilient. It can then feed its children. It can ensure that communities continue to thrive. So that's where the point of meaningful financing that really responds to what Africa needs to safeguard its children and its future.
And I think important to emphasize the point that we can have both of these conversations simultaneously, because talking about the financing and the impact and implication thereof doesn't mean that we don't care about the climate crisis that is currently threatening the continent's safety, health, education, job prospects, you name it. But we are, of course, allegedly being ignored by those who are supposed to look after those interests. And also, very importantly, and you touched on it slightly there, being excluded from decision-making that actually shapes this future for that 500 million children at the moment. Let's talk a little bit more about that. How do we make this more inclusive? How do we make sure that our leaders on the continent actually speak to us, listen to us, don't go to COP27 with plans that we as nations haven't seen, yet these plans are being brokered and, shared on our behalf?
Yes, I think that has been one of the biggest concerns we have as the African Child Policy Forum, the element of one, children and young people really participating and being involved in decision-making and even being involved in how Africa arrives at its position. That's one. The second part is, and I think this is commendable, is that the African Union has already set up a mechanism to ensure there's a committee of heads of state and governments. And then we have the Africa group of negotiators. So there are mechanisms to make sure that Africa brings its voices together in a collective. The challenge becomes, are heads of state and governments and the ministers sitting in the African negotiating group actually discussing with their citizenry what their positions should be. On the other hand, there are some very positive things that are happening. We are seeing now for the first time that there's a platform for children and youth to actually speak and participate in Sharm el-Sheikh. And that's the first time this has happened for all the COPs that have gone on. We are seeing when African Child Policy Forum held its conference on its international policy conference on climate change and child rights, we had a whole panel of young people and children taking part. And this is what needs to happen. They need to be involved, not when it comes now to COP27 and we're all sitting and decisions are being made. They need to be involved from way back when Africa is setting its joint agenda, when Africa is saying that we want grants and not loans, when Africa is saying reduce the amount of money that's going to mitigation and give it to adaptation instead. And so there are efforts, but I think the biggest question is, how are the most vulnerable populations and groups, including children and women, being able to feed into these mechanisms? Is this happening? And that's the biggest question. But I'm really pleased that we have young people, Africans really, African children, who are the most vulnerable, who are the greatest victims, but also have a lot of solutions. These children and young people know a lot. They have access to information. But for them to actually be able to contribute meaningfully, they need to have the platforms that that enable them to be heard, yes, and for their stories to be captured and retold and reported.
Dr. Nyanyuki, and that is so important, as you say, I was saying very important what you're pointing out, because as you say, there can be no climate justice if Africans and African children and young people in particular are not heard. Many say, we are now the victims of a crisis that we have very, little contribution to at this point. But if climate finance simply creates more debt, if women and girls are ignored, what exactly do we do? Again, how do we force those voices and those sentiments onto the global stage? How do we foreground all of these elements that may have gone amiss during these conversations?
I think two important things that Africans can do is the element of preparedness. And unfortunately, our governments have historically always been caught by surprise by emergencies. But even if this is a climate emergency, the warning signs have been there from the 1970s. We are seeing now old records of the old prime ministers like Margaret Thatcher telling the world that we need to have green environment, to have green economies. I mean, I saw a clip of that. And so what needs to happen is our governments need to be more prepared. The second thing is really making sure that the climate response and plans are really embedded within the national systems. We need to acknowledge that this is an environmental problem, and yes, there's the UN, the African Development Bank, all these multilaterals who are doing what they can, and though it's not enough, but we also have a sense of national responsibility as African governments for our people. And so part of that is we're seeing that there's already the mechanisms of national determined contributions. There's a domestic budgeting process. there's ensuring that money for adaptation goes to the community and is actually managed and implemented at community level. And I think South Africa is one of the countries that is leading on that, South Africa, Senegal, and Rwanda. But we want to see all these three things, the preparedness, the national determined contributions, and grassroots domestic community level adaptation programs actually taking place. Because there's always such a disconnect in our countries, unfortunately, between what happens on the ground and what happens on the global and international platform. And so what I'm really excited about COP27 is that you're seeing child and youth activists who work in some of the most remote, basic conditions in their countries, from across the continent, actually having organized themselves, prepared, and now having a common position as African youth and children in Egypt as this conversation is going on. Now, that's a good example of what our African governments need to do. But I think beyond that, we then need to see how do African children and young people's voices really influence the final decisions that are taking place. We need to start seeing leaders listening and paying more attention to what children are saying. It's not just about children sitting in the room and us say, oh yes, thank you very much, you've given us your opinion. It's really about us taking to heart what children are actually telling us and asking of us to do. They know where the shoe pinches. They're the ones wearing the shoe. Will be gone. In another 50 years, we'll all be gone. At least I'll probably be gone. But these children will be here facing the consequences of drought, of not having been well educated, of not having the skills that they require to have not just lives, but decent livelihoods.
Well, Dr. Nyanyuki, we'll continue to watch what happens at COP27, but thanks so much for engaging us on these perspectives. And that was Dr. Joan Nyanyuki, Executive Director of the African Child Policy Forum, ACPF.